Donyo 남기다 나님이 심지어 탐지게 된도 독자가 남이가 양다가 조비 산지의 공부를 보지 진행자 토바죠. 뒤에 제도 담비 주에서 뭐 세님이 부른 꾸준히 받는 리바 세다 세마슈 다 강스 다시 마 세게 다 최디 다 모두 같이 쉬원 신진에 다지 다 장주가 미치고 있다 대원주 다지 신내다 활동이다 뒤 직공주 뒤 카드를 최니 다지 민주국 고대로와 다도슨 바스도로 좀 다지고 좀 비치나스 가지 지원 농시 다 가지 공도 시원의 비제 숨을 통해와 다지 딘녀도 제 아니 민주 무시 something 무시당 아니 순간다 수명의 민주 순당한데 다들 숨이 권에 가서 휴게 시원을 신다 something 민주 남 something 무시 시대 가서 조사와치 다 디링 다 수명의 민주 시에게 다디 루센티간이 다 딘데 송사 다 디라는 게 제와요 다 직직진이 쉬는 섬서와 다만 도든다디 다지 삼대기 민주당 수명의 민주 있습니다. 당도 삼대기 민주시당 수명의 민주시 있으니 마스터 쉬네 이 수된치고 규제인데 다 여전히 좋지나 가져지다 지원하나 뭐고용도 dien장 대직다 직세시지 말 공부지 쉬나서 일단 삼대기 민주다 수명의 민주대 다 가다지 뭐라 좋던다디 로제다 제와야 요래 인다디 인다 삼대가 직막에 삼대 파지당 시라 파지 로즈티 나라 다지 가스나지 지 다든다 디가리레 삼대 파지당 되네시 시라 파지나 추비 다 신내다 하동게 되네 야 신내 공리 하동 공리 다 람 아니야 고마 가지고도 줘요레스 디 삼로 당시에라 다디 민족소소소 오주디 14분 맞추는 거다. 그래서 아니 말하면서 다지 켄고에 대 개중 차대요레스 티체도 아니 마슈에 직당 미수직 가서나 다 삼대의 민주다 수매 민주 시기 다만 아니 람도 마슈비 내가 주나요? 개중이 봐. 뭐 람도 슈네장 되니 람마디야 공부도 줘야나요? 아니 무슨 와지 민주 다 민주 나가 다시 다게 보다 티 개중이 봐. 단 지금 탈치네 무슨 저기 상계 고마 통해요. 우리 그냥 뒤주라다 삼대의 민주다 수매 민주죠. 아니 배치와 타주가니다 무슨 내봐. 도르스드나 다 삼대의 민주다 수매 민주디 아니 마치 말하는 다 켄고에디 직권을 남샤비 아버지 켄고에디 개심을 소상 아니 메드슨 제시 수준진의 주고 주제 딘 정치 is.
Please think in the following way in order to benefit all mother sentient beings who are as limitless as the infinite sky. I will attain the unsurpassed and greatest attainment, the state of the precious state of perfect Buddhahood, enlightenment. And in order to do that, I am going to engage in the study and listening of the Dharma. So we've been going through in our main lesson, the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, where we arrived at the section on serenity or shamatha. So when we get to this section about serenity and then the following section on insight, there's this sort of side lesson that comes out of as a sort of tangent that comes out of the discussions of serenity, and this is about the absorptions or the equilibrium states. So we discussed already the topic about the access concentration as well as the actual concentrations of the meditative stabilizations, the jhanas. And those we went over the last 2 weeks. So today we will continue on with a discussion of the formless states, the formless state concentrations. So many of you, the students, many of you have raised questions about the relevance of this material to our practice and the purpose for our studying it and understanding it. So I need to clarify this again. I've spent a minute clarifying this. So we have the perfections of concentration as well as the perfection of wisdom. And there's a deep connection to both of these when we talk about the equilibrium states and the concentrations, the meditative stabilization, as well as the formless state concentrations. So these are the practices of the perfection of concentration and wisdom are related to the practices of serenity and insight. They're sort of branches of them. And so when we get into these discussion about the equilibrium states, it's in relation to cultivating the paths and the practices of serenity and insight that we cultivate along the paths as well. So they're required for those practices of the perfection of concentration and wisdom. And it's not only important when we're actually already on the path, but it's important to practice and to understand, at least in a general way. It's not absolutely necessary right now to understand them completely, thoroughly, but in a rough kind of general sense that we know about them is important even before we actually are on a path. It's important while we're actually going through the stages of the paths and generating higher and higher realizations and higher and higher paths. And it's even important for after reaching the resultant state, the Buddhahood, the attainment of Buddhahood, because in that case of the Buddha, then he has to maintain those his realization or her realization in dependence upon these practices as well, the absorptions. So they're practiced sort of at every part before you're actually even in the path, and as you develop through the paths, and even at the resultant state. So this is something that's important for us to know.
트레이 줄라 만두가 코가 줄 편집이 줄라고 그랬습니다. 보다 이 창조를 뭐 친구가 막에 아니 기부 등이 가더라. 아니 도스니 소요를 해서 인자 되는 된다는 게 제라만 아마 슈기스 어떤 일을 했습니다.
So even if if the practitioner, if one of us, whoever is not on a path before they enter an actual path, then we still have to cultivate the understanding of these meditation states, and the way that an understanding or knowledge is generated is in the three-stage process of generating the wisdom arising from hearing, the wisdom arising from contemplation, and then the wisdom arising from meditation. So when we attain serenity and the union of serenity and insight,
코알라 니바 중앙에서 코알라 조시 같은 데기다 로직 거와 어디든지 말씀하시나 아니 이 코알이 줄라도 좀 하듯이 코알이 트레이 타가고 말했어. 그래서 신을 하도 고맙sam기 말하면서 가서 지치게 해요 말했어. 이 어떻게 진짜 정말 지금 근데 말하고
So we have the practice of serenity and insight, this shamatha vipassana, which we develop, and even when we're not actually engaged in the full-on practice of the equilibrium states and the different concentrations, like the meditative stabilizations and the upper realm meditations, upper realm referring again to both the meditative stabilizations as well as the formless state concentrations, then even without fully practicing them, we can practice them in a sort of, by the power of our sort of imagination, or just through a kind of our mental sort of replication of what it would be like. By understanding what they are, even without actually attaining them, we can still practice in a similar way through our imagination. And so then that's why, it becomes important to understand what these are, and especially it's important to understand the proper way to meditate on these concentrations, because we need to generate actual renunciation of samsara by understanding the faults of samsara. And if we only practice then if we don't understand all these different types of concentrations clearly, then there's a danger. The danger is that we might get to a point where we will practice them without them being completely enveloped by the genuine renunciation, or embraced by the genuine renunciation. So if these practices are not embraced by genuine renunciation, then there's the danger that they will actually become causes for birth in samsara instead of causes for liberation from samsara. So if we don't have genuine renunciation and we practice any of the four meditative stabilizations, then that becomes a cause for taking rebirth in the form realm. And if we practice the formless state concentrations without being embraced by genuine renunciation, then they become causes for taking birth in the formless realm. So then they're not becoming paths that free us from samsara. And there's a quotation from the middling section of the Lamrim Chenmo, meaning volume 2, the section which covers the this is volume 1 in the English. Sorry, it's volume 1 in the actual published editions, but it is the section on the practices shared in common for beings of middling capacity, and there's a quotation that I'm going to go over from that section.
자주 의미심문을 가리 숨으면서는 이것은 숨도와 등엔질의 기비 초와 대화라 조미나니 삼대 수반민지에 당불파도 기비 미유의 레소 삼대 아직 초와 대화용이 따라서는 지 신장의 대화지를 왔다 대화되기 잠기에 다는 분들이 아니 지권 가리래 미네 되는 공부이나 아니 something 타고니와 수만 면제라서 계획이 내사기레스 다양 되발라요 차바 로징 소와 대외장 이순에스 한 소와 당용 된도 예 되지나니 something 시반의 시세반도 기비 미유의 내소데스 르베니기 공바이노 계획베스 시바 타다라 시바로네 타비 치도 고승의 개발은 온발 뒤치나 코알라 지링당 타발라 지니스 주와이노 소다 독진다 가스나 삼대다 민주도 공유되다 그래서 미에다 타바다 탐지진이 아니 진득이 다지 타바 돈이기 삼바다 탐지지바 돈이기 삼배고 진득이 있으니 거네 장로 심지다 모두 당시 뭐지 와다 가스나 장로 마스는 다 쳐라 좀 말했어 와 장주 심지 마스는 대과지 쳐라 좀 말했지 심하듯이 디딩은 타바든다 지내다는데 공유돼 갑자기 진득이 얘는 양치 지기 표현 타둘라 만나가지 내가 그 표현 중대 대선만 되는 진득이 공부이나 형티 내가 요래서다 디든다 디송에 이제 나는 장가가 싶은다 디송도와 이제는 땅에 쉬고야 돼 가서나 다섬대 민주다 소민주 공대야 돼 아니 지 고마 점마 되는 거지 다 신내다 하도 고마 돼야 되니 가서 가리기 싶으시나 아니 배지 땅 코안이 주위지 안 탐지집이 고만도 다들 손 타바다 탐지집이 고만도 비치도 와 땅이 중기 맞은 바이나 아니 그거 고유주를 두고 어래 정주 승진 맞으나 아니 탐지지 못하게 그걸 두고 말 인도선에다 딘디지 고무 쓰바이나 아니 딜레디 아니 뭐 두고 말에 있으다 남는 친구나 다랑티 공들 소도와 인도선에다 얘기된다 말 가스나 다딘다 디고 막 최시 다 최시스나 다가서 선대민주 친이다 소민주 들로 되는 디 빠르라요 디슈나 아니 저랑도 되게 양치가 당당당한 성도 당당당에 쳐버리고 그랬으면 얘다 딘디지 슈어 인스
So then we have this quotation, and I don't know if the class has received it, the English translation, but it is in the text in the first chapter, first volume. I don't know which chapter. So I will just read the quotation first. And it's following a quotation from Master Vasubandhu. And it says, the preceding discussion is primarily considering a pleasant affect or pleasant feeling, which is generated from concentration. And why is that the topic of the discussion? Because a movable karma to be born in the third jhana on down, the third meditative stabilization on down, up to the first is accumulated. So karma, a movable karma to be born in the different form realms, the first through third form realms gets accumulated. Then attachment to the desire realm is overturned, and then at that stage, the pleasant affect and feeling itself irritates the mind. So in order to have a neutral affective state, the practitioner accumulates the compounded karma, that is the immovable karma for being born in the fourth jhana up through the peak of existence. So now the formless realm. And that is what was intended by the words of Acharya Vasubandhu. By understanding that that topic in that way, in such a way, then grasping attachment to all of existence can be overturned. And for the purpose of attaining liberation, one totally engages in the gathering and creation of virtue, which brings them further and further away from samsara and closer to liberation. So here, the point being made is that we can't just meditate on the meditative stabilizations and the formless realm concentrations and these different states of absorption without the proper understanding of the goal, without an understanding of what the true goal is. So what is the true goal? It's in order to be liberated from samsara. So we must have that aspiration, that desire to be free from samsara, and then practice these things. It has to be embraced by. Embraced by is meaning that by the power of this aspiration for liberation, by the power of the bodhicitta, as well as by the power of refuge and the three jewels, that itself is causing our practice to flourish. And that's sort of what we mean when we say it's embraced by these other qualities or other mind states. So, so then you saw in this verse here in the Lamrim Chenmo, in Tsongkhapa's great treatise, that there's this danger of having attachment to desire, attachment to the pleasure of the desire realm, the pleasure. And if one practices concentration with that, with that attachment, then they will be reborn in the upper realms. And likewise, even if they have attachment to the feeling of equanimity, then they will be reborn. So that is the danger that we have to watch out for. So it's not just merely meditating on serenity, insight, and these different concentrations. It's doing it with an understanding that it's in order to attain liberation, in order to attain complete enlightenment. And so that's why we have this discussion that's sort of like a side tangential discussion, which comes out of our main text. And we went into this much detail because I had thought by getting a rough understanding of these types of concentrations, this whole topic, then it would sort of give a little bit more nuance in your understanding when you learn about serenity and insight, and it would sort of help to improve your sort of ability to analyze the text and to give rise to more nuanced questions and more nuanced understanding.
타운에서 지금 있는 다 삼대기 민주시 나무 수면 민주시 생다 가진 프로세스와 수면 삼대기 민주시 샤고의 교제대 가진 프로세스와 아니 지 사직이 초와라고나 아니 지 가스나지 차바다 자직이 차니 아니 삼대기 민주시 정리와래 세인데 가진 프로세스와 어디나시 전에 다 지금 수면 민주대 시정리와디 다 시샤고 교제대야 와 시고르디도 되고 되는 다 시샤고 교제대 가지래 와 삼대가 님주가 시샤고 교제 가지래 시시샤니와 땅가다 출라서 미샤고 교제 가지래 했습니다. 뒤 주어들 내고와 인도산이 삼대가 님주도 가리고 있는 샤워했으나 아니 지 소화들아 진짜 사직이 소화들아 너무 소화라 가더라 nga요 거와 소화 통에 아니 이 가스나 대화 아니 이 이미데 이 대화 소화 땅님스니까 소화들아 사직이 소화들아 nga시 소화라 가더라 아니 사직이 소화되니 가스는 이미데라 착바트지들아 삼대 담부식 동안라더니 라바드라 착바트지들아 삼대 니와지 아니 이데라 착바트지들아 삼대 수마지 아니 대화라 차대 사직이 소화 대화들아 착바트지들아 삼대 시와스 소화 땅님들아 착바트지들아 아니 가스는 삼대 나와지 내가 할수나 소화 땅님들아 착바트지와라 팔랑마도나 지게미 람지들아 착바트지 두고 말해서 가스는 고 켜버두지 두마리 켜버두지 두마 된다와디 차대 지와라 아니 처음이다 보고서 또 그거에서 이 차대 지도를 수수기고 내스 뭐 뒤는 신체이다 아니 소미고 윤주들이랑 시샤고 규제 가리랬으나 아니 뒤셰디라 아니 나 소미 윤주들 뒤셰고라 뒤셰라 되니 이거 뒤셰 사직이 되니 뒤셰 아니 라파라 차대 지오고 시작거리스 이제 뒤셰디라 아니 뒤셰 시 아니 지난 뒤셰미다 응알리고 때 아니 뒤셰 nga와디라 차대 지도에다 지딩감 요 말이 뒤셰 시레스 뒤셰 시디 가르스나 다 배는 담보디 아니 수다 토비 아니 뒤셰 보다 뒤 차대 제제가 아니 수메 담보디셰 수메 담보님주 다 아니 그지 남기 뒤셰 아니 사직이 남겼다 남갔다 다 있어 남기 뒤셰라 되면 차바자지들아 아니 수메 니와 다 남식이 되니 양 남식이 뒤셰 아니 차바자지들아 아니 수메님주 아니 수마 다 지양스다 순자라고 지양에도 섬이야 뒤시지 라고지 되고 티라 참바지들아 아니 시지 다 수메기 섬데 아니 섬데서 수메기 민주 시와하고 두신 되고 그랬어 다 순자라고기 제라다 순자 참물라 차제 지어나 다디 지kim이 남기 지도가 말해서 디디네 지가서 지가 디콘도 다 수메기 되는 거와지 요 말이었어 뭐도 지내다 삼대기 민주디 사직이 초월라 차바 제제기 차리 시작거래 수면 주시디 아니 상식이 두시라발라 아니 와 아니 참바 자지고 시작하래 그래서 어떤 시작한데 어떤 일이 오지
상맥이 두시라봐
상제
상제기 두시라봐
네가 상제다
상제기 좋아 상제기 두시 Okay, so now we're back into the main topic about these concentrations and the four. So we had a list of 4 meditative stabilizations, 4 jhanas, and we also have the 4 formless states. And what is the purpose or the reason for giving 4 of them? Why are 4 posited and why do 4 exist? Well, it's in relation to the separation from attachment to 4 different types of feeling, 4 different types of affect. And this is for the 4 meditative stabilizations. So the 4 different types of feeling so there are 5 different types of feeling given, and those are the unpleasant, pleasant feelings, the mental unpleasant feelings and pleasant mental feeling, and then the equanimity, feeling that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, neutral feeling, you can say. So the first concentration is what the first meditative stabilization is attained when one has freedom from attachment to the feeling of suffering. The second is attained when there's freedom of attachment to mental suffering, mental unpleasant feeling. Then the third is attained when there's separation of attachment from pleasant feeling. The fourth is attained when there is separation from attachment to a mental pleasant feeling. And then in the fourth concentration, there's only the feeling or the affective state of equanimity, a neutral affective state. And the only person or type of practitioner who is able to be free of attachment to that is one who's an Arya, that has an Arya path that sees the disadvantages of all samsara. Then those are the 4 reasons for positing 4 jhanas. And what about the 4 formless states? Why are there 4 of those? So in the first set of 4, the jhanas, they were talking about freedom from attachment to these contaminated feelings, 4 different types of contaminated feelings. And then the formless states are posited in relation to being free of 4 different types of attachment to contaminated perception. So the meditative stabilizations or jhanas are in relation to freedom from attachment to 4 contaminated feelings or affect states, whereas the formless realms, the formless concentrations are posited in relation to being free from attachment to 4 different types of perception. And what are those? So the first is attained when there's freedom from attachment to perception of form, materiality. The second is attained when there's freedom from attachment to the perception of sky, space. The third is attained when there's freedom from attachment of perception of consciousness. And the fourth is attained when there's freedom from the perception that there's nothing whatsoever, the perception of nothingness. The first one again is called. Well, yeah, we'll go into it. So then at the fourth formless concentration, then which is neither perception nor non-perception, there's again the only one that could be free from attachment to that is someone with an Arya path. 그래서 무슨 시바 디나 차저 어디 차저 제투긴디 파파 시바
수메 시바요와 수메 시비 두시 가리르죠. 아니 지 순자를 참고에 다른 것도 지 순자를 받지에도 시베만이 순자 다 참고 두시 참고를 했어. 두시 참고 지에 메시지로 두시 참고들 자체에 되는데 파파도 지 파파만 말했어.
So because it's a very subtle type of perception that there's no gross perception whatsoever is sort of the type of perception, then it's only possible for an Arya being to be free from attachment to that subtlety of perception.
아니 사직이 두시 디네 직분을 잡아매와 참모 여기 있더니 딘데 두시들라 차트 지게들라 팔람 그 준생 가르쳤으나 뒤 잡아두지 동아리 잡아두지 동에 참으로 했어. 잡아두지 동에 참으라 아니 차트 지투인데 팔람도 지게 수수교를 남기 차트 지투미 도와봤으나 뒤 차트 지와라 아니 처음이다 봐. 좋아. 딘데지 딘데 무슨 또게 딘데지 고거리 진짜 처음이다 무슨 또게 팔람도 지 수수교를 남기 요 말이 있습니다. 뒤차네 아니 수수교를 남기 아니 수명님 주시고들 차트지 두고 말이지. 그래서 수명님 중가와 마시고 주제 가리래라면 수명님 주당 선대님 주도 가가 아니 지대에 되는다 지금 주투에게 뒤 온도진 시월에스 뒤지다 딜라 고마게 되는 차트지인들라 parlament을 지금에서 아니 수명님 주시 가와지 수명 말이지. 진짜 시를 창의해서 근데 담배되게 나야 되지 샤워도 돼.
So then again, just to clarify that, the final of the formless concentrations, which is called peak of existence, and there's a perception that's very subtle, where it's sort of not a perception of anything gross whatsoever. Then the only person who can overcome that attachment, the attachment to that perception, is an Arya being, because it's a type of pervasive conditioned suffering. And only an Arya being has that subtlety and clarity to see that pervasive conditioned suffering as a fault and be able to overcome attachment to it. The reason also is because to really overcome attachment to that pervasive conditioned suffering, a person needs to have a direct perception of subtle impermanence. It's necessary to be able to have a realization of subtle impermanence and a direct realization of subtle impermanence, which only an Arya being has. So that's why there are these 4 formless states, not a 5th one, because the 4 of them are all listed and posited in relation to an ordinary being as opposed to an Arya being. So these are practices and concentrations that ordinary beings have the ability to practice and to attain.
다 삼대의 님주당 송의 님주디 다 개바 가발레 버스나 삼대의 님주디 다 인다디 조 예람이라고 미과다 예람이 나니 이다 예람이라고 보내 시합이더니 국민 님주디 삼대의 님주당 미과다 예람이 나니 아니 가리 미과미라고 보내 시합이 국민 님주디 아니 송의 님주 있습니다. 지가서나 삼대의 님주당 송의 님주디다 미라고 개바 디셔버렸어.
And again, coming sort of back down to the fundamental reason for having the difference between the 4 meditative stabilization concentrations and the 4 formless concentrations is related to the way of dividing them, the 4 meditative stabilizations being divided by way of their branches. Branches meaning the different mental factors present in those concentrations. Then the formless state concentrations are distinguished and divided in terms of the observed object, the object which they are observing, these different perceptions. And so that is the way of making that is how we're distinguishing between the 4 jhanas, the 4 meditative stabilizations, from the 4 formless concentrations.
어두신이다 다 삼대의 님주시디 는 예라고니 샤디 가서 랍사소와 가서지 님베야라 아니 표현이야라 니기야라 스노도디 삼대 당분이 무슨 시간을 미라 차소와 아 수맥의 님주도라 아니 지가리래 님베야라 미다와 요 말에 표현이야라 미다와 요 말에 니기야라 미다와 요 말에 팀에서 아니 수맥 님주도 예라고니 마셔같이 미버디 아니 미다와 샤니
And last week we went over these different branches of the 4 meditative stabilizations, and those included branches which were the antidote branches that were the benefit branches, and then the sustaining branches. So those are different for each of the 4 meditative stabilizations. Whereas with the 4 formless state concentrations, there's no difference. between their branches. They all have the same branches, the same mental factors that accompany them. So instead, how do we distinguish them? In terms of their perception or in terms of their observed object.
다 뒤집이 다 삼대기 민주네 다 수면 민주라야 표현하는 거라서는 다 삼대 민주 삼대 12 민주부터 들어왔다 삼대 12 민주네 다 진짜 강사 다이 삼대 12 민주 공개 강사들이 다 가지래 뭐지 수기 다 수기 되니 가서 규칙이 들어 아니 직교 통일로 다 교통이 다 뒤로 차바다 가지기 치도 아니 수면 또 타고 뒤로 수면 뭔가 다얘기 가지래 니도 선다가서 니도 가지래 이제 뒤다 니도 툭세지 줘서 봐 어디 니도 툭디 지금 지경이 선대 당국이 니도 뒤 샤워 남신 아니 막이 시세기 봐도 저거래 가서 내가 줘서 완전 니도 뒤니 공부하지 지금 지경체 가서는 아니다 3대시 민주토비 강사디기 와 3대시 무시토비 강사디기 다 3대시 원이다 가르스는 수라 이들이 교통이 와 수비 두시저와 다 수비 두시데 아니 베나지 토바당 아니 수베나 이당 다 tinde기와 아니 지금 수기다 제 가리다 나와 뭐지 샤여저와 근조라다 순한게다 수기 나와디 누가 지구도 삼니 다 수라더니 차제 제 차저가 차바지로 리엔디 아니 다 차바지지기 되니 다 수면 누가 대기님도 당부 아니 가지게 뭐 tinde지기 진이 수도를 빠지지 세니다 그러나 아니 선대 시발한테 교당 아니 수면을 그냥 초도 따기더니 시라수 따기로 진이 수도를 빠지지 세디게 고민이 다 tinde지 고민이 다 수면 당부에 수면 누가 대기더니 무의식이 녀도 어떤 녀도 디가들라 다 수기 두시도 들어다 교통이 가서는 아니 수면 그냥 수기 두시 수비더니 가서는 수 그냥 가리리 입당 카돌라 소비 수당 아니 봐서 토해지로 왔다 그냥 수도 지금도 봐 토해도 와로 어디들 토해당 아니 수 나서 입당 카돌라 소비 두시도 들어라 아니 교통이 다 뒤라 아니 차가 자지 그 지게 다 뒤에 다지 수미 두시 아니 남가다 타예시도 쓴다 통매 와 남가들한테니 가도다 입라 소비 개발매와 아니 다나시 토에라 소바 매와 tinde기 상무지 고여되든 미바디 아니 수면이 도모디 미바디 남가들이 거래스 남가다 타예수 쓴다베 순자라고 지안에 다 순자라고 생각하시나 근데 토비 두시다 어디디 입이 두시라 소바 근데 가야면 삼에다 아니 tinde기 아니 tinde기 두시라 교통의 창과를 제직이 아니 당부들아 아니 신의 내용도 진이 수술을 봐야지 왔다 진이 수술을 봐야지 아니 뒤에서도니 아직까지 몇 봐야지 가와도 봐야지 아니 저 봐야지 라도 해 봐야지 아무도 봐지 왔다 이제 쓴다 이제 뒤에도 무슨 줘야지 다 가진 낭신 나와랬다 삼대 시와라 되니 차바들라 아니 저리 지금 구신이 와 아니 지 당부에 되니 진이 수술을 봐야지 아니 뒤에서 몇 봐야지 되니 가스나 지금 고스 아니 가와도비 지금 고스 아니 가르쳐 또 예반 지금 중 고스 뭐다 중대 지금 구들이 봐하시는 게 또는 다 스탠데비다 수면 다 섬대 민주라 때문에 섬대 시비 민주 섬대 시발라 때문에 차과다 제연들 어떤 좀 맞춰와 지금디 수면 남과 다얘기 예도체 다 차과 제연이다 되게 교통으로 와 아니지 섬대 시발라 교통 섬대 시비 수기 되는 두시도 강하나 교통이 다 남기 두시주고 일하시니 안 근데거든요 교통단위로 감 공원을 다 지금 공원에다 수검당 수면이라 되니 백교 수검이 되니 배지 배지 가르스나 초 노아 시원이 봐 테라도네 섬제 시원디 아니 지금은 그 가르스나 수기다 딘데기 수다 토비 두시에서 딘데 교는 선다 딘데기다 아니 감공을 싫어서 따고 와 어디 싫어서 따와 때네 다 방자들이 세바도 준비치고 구인하네 이 고디라더니 차바 제어도 아니 수면는 것 같아요 무시 세대 도모레스 다 무시 가둘라 아니 가슴 수다 토비 두셔 마음이 왔지 남과 주부 남과 타에서 예배된 두셔 대zam이 딱히 임바디 이거디 세진나라 제르미들이 송도와 어디 많이 로나 삼년 시바 토바나 난조바디 수라 교연당 수메라 유대 통에 수기 두셔 도비치 카도다 입당 절자라서 세마 자기 남기 두셔 코나 공부나 무시 소 나위 수당 장당 빨라 소바 나위 토바당 거제 김유사라 소비 나위 나소바 뒤신는 누데스 게다가 이대장 탐지 미주하고 소다 독스니 이때 뭔가 다행이다 예동이다 이제 어떻게 수행이 되겠다 지금 이거 때문에 이제 했습니다.
So now we arrive at the first of the formless state concentrations, and so in the formless, just like with the four meditative stabilizations, we had these. First, we had the access concentration, and then the actual concentration. So this goes back to the first class we had on this topic 3 weeks ago. And so the access concentration, again, had these 7 different types of mental engagement, or 7 types of attention, 7 attentions. Those, again, were the attention that contemplates marks, the attention that is arisen from belief, the attention when there is separation, attention that contemplates joy and withdrawal, attention that is investigative, attention that is a final practice, and attention that leads to the result of the final practice. So these 7 attentions that accompany, that are part of the access concentrations of the 4 meditative stabilizations, are likewise part of the access concentrations for the 4 formless state concentrations. So when we get to the first formless state concentration, which is called infinite space, then we also have these 7. So for example, what would be the way in which the attention which contemplates marks accompanies the access concentration of the first formless state concentration? So the attention which contemplates marks is the one that sees the faults of the lower ground, or the lower state. So it's able to see the faults of form, the form realm. And so the practitioner is analyzing, they're thinking about how gross, how coarse that, shape, color, all these different objects like walls and buildings and things being distant and near, all these different qualities of form, of material existence are faulted. There's something unsatisfactory there, and so the practitioner then desires to be free of this form realm and to just abide in infinite space, to just have complete freedom from any obstruction, to be unobstructed in terms of spatial, obstruction and tangibility, and just to be in infinite space. So then, when they actually then attain the separation from attachment to form. So in the access concentration, they're analyzing, and that acts as an antidote to the attachment to the form realm, because they're seeing the faults of the form realm. Then when they actually are freed of that attachment to the form realm, that's when they attain the actual concentration of the infinite space concentration. So it's because they actually kind of had a sense of irritation from seeing all these appearances of form, and they desire to be free of that obstructiveness of form, the fault that they saw. And then they attain the actual concentration, which is merely, so in that actual concentration, then there are no longer the 7 different types of attention that were in the access concentration. And so what's left? It's simply the perception. There's just infinite space. There's infinite space, and that perception is what is present here in the actual concentration of infinite space.
차바 충분 그래서 선대 그 대발아 차바 충분 말로 그래서 수매들아 다 다시 수고물라 선대 시발라 받다 선대 시발라 아니 차비 수 두시죠 콜라 차바들아 충분히 지금 수 친구들아요 충분히 친구 증나요 수 충분히 숨지니 다 뒤수디 녀도 둥기 좀 마시 방법을.
So again, those 7 types of access concentration attentions, they had to all be practiced in order to eliminate the small, middling, and large attachment to the form realm. So we discussed the small, middling, and large attachment to the desire realm in previous weeks. And so here it's attachment to the form realm. Okay, so now this is just as how J. Rinpoche, J. Tsongkhapa says in our text. So an investigation of what formless states focus on. This has 4 parts: infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothing whatsoever, and peak of existence. Infinite space. When practitioners reach the 4th concentration, they view the form realm as faulty and the formless realm as admirable. In order to stop the discrimination of form, they meditate exclusively on the discrimination of space, devoid of any mark of color, shape, or touch, and so on, so that the discrimination of the sight of any form, such as blue or yellow, any obstruction, such as clay blocks of walls, any particular thing, such as clothes, jewelry, pleasure gardens, mountains, and so on, subside and do not occur in any way whatsoever, even if the gaze of their mind is directed towards them. So the process of going from the access concentration into the actual concentration here in the formless state concentrations is exactly the same as it was during the 4 concentrations, the meditative stabilizations. So what happens is someone who is entering into the access concentration of, so starting just with the first one of infinite space, they're seeing the faults of the lower state, the lower state here being the form realm. And so then the power of that access concentration and practicing it allows them to be free of the attachment to the form realm, the form. And then it's the second formless state, which is infinite consciousness, that now you enter the access concentration there and see the faults of the state lower than that, which now at that level is infinite space. So the infinite consciousness access concentration is understanding and analyzing the faults of infinite space. Likewise, and being free from attachment to infinite space, one moves into the actual concentration of the infinite consciousness. Likewise, in the third formless state, which is nothing whatsoever, one sees at the access concentration, one sees the faults of the infinite consciousness and is able to be freed from attachment to infinite consciousness and attain the actual concentration of nothing whatsoever. And then the peak of existence, the 4th formless state, has an access concentration that understands the faults of nothing whatsoever, frees the practitioner from that desire and that attachment to it, and then enters the actual concentration of peak of existence.
없어라 교단이 아니 차바 되는데 아니 수만 남시 타액이 무시도 당 무시 도면도 다 디스나더니 지 남시다 타액수 무슨 남가 수매 당부 남가기 두시에들아 차와 남시기 두시에디가 딜레비디 아니 가스나 수매 남가 타액 무시 있습니다 수매 중이고 디샤고레스 디바디 인다 디시 세리나라 수 남기 두시라고 통이 대도비치 남기 유진기 남시 점기 탐지 차바 묘가고 소대도스네 중도와서.
So then one has this sort of irritation that came from seeing all the form, appearances of form, and had the desire to be free from these appearances of form. And then they generate the access concentration of infinite space. And eventually, all those appearances of form subside, and they attain the actual concentration of infinite space. From there, they have to now move on. And so through practice, they start to see that there are faults of the infinite space also. So they desire to be free of attachment to infinite space, and they enter the access concentration of the second formless concentration, which is infinite consciousness. And so in infinite space, again, there is simply the perception. This is infinite space, and that's it. And when they enter into the second formless concentration, infinite consciousness, then they finally are able to be free of the lower state, infinite space, and enter the actual concentration of infinite consciousness, where there's merely the perception. This is just infinite consciousness. This is just infinite consciousness. So then that's the actual concentration of the third formless state, infinite consciousness. Oh, and so the text again now continues on, just one short sentence. Infinite consciousness. They view the discrimination of space as gross, and in order to stop it, become resolutely intent on just the all-pervading consciousness that had space as its object.
다 수면 남가 타야지라 다 님주 수바 아니 지하면스 다 지하면 되겠으나 다 남시다 다 남가 타야지라 남시 타야 내가 다 남시 타야기다 남시다 타야서 그래서 다 남시라는 이 뒤시디다 담비들 뒤시 차와라 왔다 다양 남시 뒤시들어야 내외도야 남시네야 뒤 남시 뒤시 요 뒤들더라더니 한 교회 통에 남들와 아니 남시도 타야서 님비 뒤시들어야 교회 통에 다양 뒤라 차바디 도에치도 일도 말라 때니 아니 다 순자라 지양에도 그냥 다 지르와 다 남시 전에다 뒤에 남기 뒤시당 아니 가지래 수메티네 가지래다 수다 수메 니가 기타 뒤시 지양 섬에다 도수 삼모지 미가 다양도 지양민도 지양 매바지로 왔다 지양 매바 코랑가 섬도 아니 예지 일도 공부시 통이더니 뒤 같더니 남시 뒤시더라더니 차발론이다 남시 다얘기다 수면수다 같이 니와 남시 다얘기더니 니수들아 차발 제스인도 아니 지양미 누가 수면 이더니 님주시와 지양미라 봐 독신의 제도 아니 지양미 세디 가리 미바디 같이 없으나 아니 코랑기다 미바디 지양 가야민도 섬에 다가서 수다 수맥이 다지 수기 뒤시당 수맥이 있는 가서는 남가당 남식이 뒤시에도 섬에 드리고 민기니 니바치에도 아니 지엠에 오시디 니보레스 어다티 이바티 다든지 시팅나라 남식이 뒤시라고 통해 대도비질 수지연당 수맥이 미바 자와는 지양 많이네 미바 지양에도 님도 몇번 수단도
냠도 뭐가 시베티 냠도 뭐가 시베티 똑선 터시가 냠도 뭐가 지암 메스 냠도 뭐가 사나 지
아니 다니가 지어와 이거 지암도 사바지다 두시 공리와 다들 남기 두시와 남기 지라든 남시 두시와 남시 두시 다가랑나 교연 통이와 두시가 교연 통인데 다 이제 가서는 수비 두시다 수매 두시 가리네다 디라다 이범도 섬다 지암에 섬에보다 딘데지 미바치에저로 미바 단 진짜 수면님 주시바디 미바디 지암내바디 그래 지암내바 수다 수맥이 되니 미바 지암내바 tindicism diaries.
So after a practitioner has attained the actual concentration of infinite space, then they move on to the third concentration, the third formless concentration. I think previously I said the third was infinite consciousness, but sorry, that was a mistake. That was the second. So the third is nothing whatsoever. So nothing whatsoever is first engaged in with the access concentration, where again they see the faults of infinite consciousness. So in the infinite consciousness, there is simply the perception, the infinity of consciousness. This is infinite consciousness. But the person moves on and enters the access concentration of the third formless concentration, nothing whatsoever. And they see that there are faults with infinite consciousness. So they want to reverse and overcome the attachment to infinite consciousness. So they practice this access concentration with its 7 attentions. And then they get to a point where they have a perception or have a perception or thought. There's not infinite space, there's not infinite consciousness, there's neither form nor formless, nor formlessness. There's nothing whatsoever. So after they actually are freed from attachment to that infinite consciousness, then they have this understanding. There's neither form nor formlessness. There's not space, there's not consciousness, there's nothing whatsoever. And they abide in this concentration, that there is nothing whatsoever. Oh, and then to read the text, I apologize for forgetting that. Nothing whatsoever. They view the discrimination of consciousness as gross, and in order to stop it, search for a focus that is form-based or formless, and finding nothing whatsoever, become resolutely intent on a space where there is nothing whatsoever to focus on. Then after the third formless concentration, one sees that also is that the perception of nothing whatsoever also is sort of a coarse perception. They see it as having faults, and they go through the access concentration of the fourth formless state. And they practice the access concentration, which allows them to be free of those 9 types of attachment from the large of the large to the small, those levels of attachment. And they practice meditation to be free of the attachment to even that rough or coarse perception of nothing whatsoever, seeing that as too coarse. And they focus only on a very, very subtle perception. So they meditate now on this subtle perception, and they attain the access concentration of the peak of existence, which is also called neither perception nor non-perception. Or maybe a more literal translation could be that's fine. Yeah, that's how it's usually translated. So neither perception nor non-perception, which is the fourth formless realm concentration.
양 메민스는 두시 첨부 매번 말했어. 봐. 다 두시 라바 아니 별에 있는 방송 중에 다지 가는 비 두시 넘시기 두시 지엠 두시 다 뒤딩도 수미 두시 승다도 수는 수미 두시 지당 수미기 두시 수 보다 뒤도 강원 두시 라바지 다 두시 라바디 다바 눈이 와다 눈이 다 두시 첨부 바시를 리바디스나 아니 두시 민민기지 민민스에서 두시 라바 내장 두시 때문에 말하는 것은 말이 첨부 요리 그래서 딜라 두시 민민기지 세디 어두 다이 마스티라 아니 시제스 딜라 가서 시비 시징우시 시징 인줄라 그래서 다 고역이 나니다 네 도쇼디와 도쇼디다 이렇게 좀 가서나 민주 소민주 시법이 네디 단니는 도쇼로 잡으러 봐 what teaching 시제양체 두시메 민주야스 다 디임바 디디스 시징나라 시번이 지연에도 냐바라 라바 통에 대도비치 두시 라바니 여바 마인 차원이 매바 민도 냠도 여바 스타디 공당된 같은데 지 이소샤서 시번이 있으시도
So then why is it called the concentration or the formless concentration of neither perception nor non-perception? Well, because it's saying that because it's a state where there's no coarse perception, but perception isn't completely eliminated. There is subtle perception still. So the subtle perception is not absent, but coarse perception is absent. So it's referred to as neither perception nor non-perception. Don't know if that makes as much sense in English as in Tibetan, but anyway, that's the explanation. So what happens there is that, again, it's also called the peak of existence. And so why is it called the peak of existence? Because it's the highest point in samsara. So it's called the equilibrium or absorption of peak of existence. It's also called neither perception or non-perception for these two reasons. And again, it's a state where all of the coarse perceptions from the form, the perception of form, and then the three perceptions in the formless states, the infinite space, infinite consciousness, and nothing whatsoever, are all gross, are all coarse, and those all subside. So those are pacified, and then there's only a very subtle type of perception. And so this is as Tsongkhapa writes, peak of existence. They view even the notion of nothing whatsoever as gross, and in order to stop it, become resolutely intent on the notion that there is no gross discrimination or perception, but not an absence of subtle discrimination or perception.
다 수면이 분이 비가서 아니 남기 두시들한 교연 따위고니 아니 가서나 남식이 두시 다 수면이 주시비 가서 다 남식이 두시들한 교연 따위고니 아니 지암미비 미바 소자라 봐 지암미도 선미바 어디 미바 어디 고메디 아니 지암미비 민주 선대 아니 선대서 수면이 주 수반이 미바 지미 공단이 다 되네 아니 시제가 좋더니 이제 지암미바기 되네 두시에 대한 작화 통에 기가 교연단이 아니 두시 첨부 바시기 봐. 소다도 지내다 그 숨이 당분이 봐. 시와기다 바두기다 지금 당분들아 숨이 남가 타에 니바다 남시 타에 수바들아 지엠에 아니 시바들아 아니 시제에서다 뒤스말 숨이 인주시 조단데 어디에 조직까지 두고 그랬어. 미바디야 타기 고도 시와나시 어디 방어적인 도수 미바디 도수 시하고 그랬어. 이제는 숨이 인주디 미비고니 샤워서다 미바 미타발이 도와서
So as we started this discussion saying that the way we discriminate between the four formless states is by way of their observed objects or their focal, the things they focus on, their observed object. So how is that? Well, when someone's first attaining the state of infinite consciousness, the formless state of infinite space, they first see the faults of the perception of form, and then they have solely a perception of this infinite space. Then they see that there are faults in that perception even, but that is too coarse, too gross. And so they generate then the concentration, which is infinite consciousness. And they have a perception of there's merely consciousness, only infinite consciousness. Then they move on and see that there are faults with that perception as well. And so they generate the perception of nothing whatsoever and think, oh, nothing exists whatsoever, and have that as their object, their perception. And then they finally see that all of those other types of perceptions are coarse, are gross, and they desire to have only subtle perception. So they then attain the fourth formless concentration, which is this neither perception nor non-perception. And they have merely this very, very subtle, very subtle perception. And so this is the way in which the four focal objects, the four, the contents of the meditations are changing throughout the four formless states. So first there's only space, merely space. Then the thought, there's merely consciousness. Then the thought, there's nothing whatsoever. Then the thought, there's just this absence of gross perception, but still a very subtle perception.
3대 당 총리 친구 20건배 3대 당고 깨와 수 3대 당고 지다와 신도 한만을 대신되어 있습니다. 네 순순 어떤 도수니 계획이 둘러두고 다 균님주 3대에서 도수말이에요.
기운 문족에서
나다 코와 빈지기 내치기 아니 내가 그거다.
이 구조는 균조 말아. 기운 용족을 그러.
균 주스나다. 감고 빈지기 되는 균치기 용주들아 균주스다.
So then we had these discussion of the formless state concentrations is completed. And so when we talk about, again, the formless concentrations or the meditative stabilizations, the 4 concentrations, they are all attained or attainable by a person in the desire realm. They're practices that can be done by a person in the desire realm. Now, not everyone in the desire realm is able to. For instance, the 3 lower realms, people or beings in the 3 lower realms are not able to practice and attain these concentrations, these equilibrium states, because they don't have the proper requirements to do so. They don't have the conducive conditions. Also, people who live in the northern section of the world called Zhang Daminyan, don't have the Sanskrit or English of that, then so then after practicing with in these different types of concentrations, one will attain or one can attain the different births as a result. So that's where we have this term come up now, which is the causal equilibrium or causal absorption. It means that when someone's practicing, all the different stages of the 4 meditative stabilizations, the 4 formless state concentrations, they go through these different stages with the small, the middling, and the great stages. And in relation to each of them, there's, for the meditative stabilizations, there are 17 different rebirth states that one can take. 5 of them are only for Arya beings, so really we're talking about 12, 3 for each of the 4 concentrations. Then in the formless realm, then one will be born into that formless realm as a result of practicing. So so then I was just asking about one of the concepts that came up in the last class, but since we already went through that, we don't have to go over it again. So so again, this is now said in the text here. So it says, explanation of the results of having cultivated the concentrations and formless states. A quote from the Compendium of Knowledge. The 3 births of the first concentration, 1 in the entourage of great Brahmas, 2 occupying the position of their sacrificial priest, 3 great Brahma, are from having cultivated a small, middling, and big first concentration. As with the first concentration, so too the rest of the concentrations, each has 3 births as well. Thus it says that by cultivating the 4 small, middling, and big concentrations, they produce triads of births, starting from birth in the entourage of the great Brahmas up to birth as a great result god. So these are names of different heavenly realms, and the form realm. Hence, both the form realm container world and the ripened result, that is the juice, meaning the person living in the container world, are rebirth concentrations because they are the empowered result and ripening result of the equilibrium concentration, respectively. So it's again emphasizing that there's these equilibrium concentrations are causes of these different realms, being born in these different realms.
가스나 오다 지금 답이다 신중 대삼기가 미비된 풍부지모도 수맥이 되는 즉 수요만 다 메두다 그랬으니 수면내라 그래요. 다 수면을 감 내내요 말와서 내 당분이 왔습니다. 이제기다 수 이내수면도 가려서는 수면을 개발해야 수면들가 다 세고 와다 즉 세진동당 또바 토면당 굉장히 개발을 해서 그래서 아니 수면 배는 남과 타야 되나요? 남과 타야 민주들은 내내 아니 배 세진동 또바 토면 윤대인 최종 굉장히 개발 남시 타야 민주들이요 다 나시고 대신에 수맥이 민주들 계획이 주되라요. 다 총리 지부고 말 때문에 어떻게 얘기를 했어.
So we have now this discussion of the causal equilibrium states, equilibrium concentrations. And likewise, we had for the 4 concentrations, the 4 meditative stabilizations, we also have for the 4 formless concentrations. So we can also refer to those as causal equilibrium states or causal absorptions. So now in the formless realm, so now we're talking about actually being born in someone who is now born in the formless realm as a result of their meditation practice, then there's no form, right? So if there's no form, there's no place. There's no place where beings live. There's no abode of beings. So all there is perception, or all there is consciousness. That's the only thing there. So in what sense then can we distinguish between the different birthplaces, because there is no actual place in the typical sense? So it's in terms of the length of their lifespan, in terms of their lifespans, that they're distinguished, in terms of having different, taking a birth in a different kind of degree of state. Their lifespans, also the sort of the degree or the quality and degree of their realization, whether it's a higher or lower realization. And in general, in terms of the sort of distinguishing between the amount of qualities, of good qualities that the being has, so a greater amount or a smaller amount of good qualities, and in that way we can talk about them being in different birth states. So again, we have the formless birth in the formless realms and also birth in the form realms. And that's as described earlier by meditating on those various states and the small, middling, and large, or small, middling, and great practices or degrees of the concentrations, then one will take birth in the relevant state that concords with their practice. So after that, we don't actually have the translation here in the current translation that's been given out. But after this, then comes a discussion of the uncontaminated concentrations and the uncontaminated equilibrium states. And what are these? Well, these are simply described in relation to an Arya being, a superior being, and the paths of the Aryas when the concentration becomes, when the Arya path becomes the basis for these concentration states to be practiced. So then a being in an Arya state can practice these meditative concentrations, these four meditative stabilizations, as well as the four formless concentrations, with a focus of with a focal object of many different types. It can be with a directly perceiving mind, where they're having a direct perception of an object. It can be through the being mixed with a meaning, generality, or a mental image. It can be conceptual. It can be all those different types, but it's where there's an Arya path that is acting as the support for the concentration. And then again, just kind of reviewing here. So we had, I'm just going to look at the text from the few weeks ago. So I'm trying to be as consistent as possible in terms. So we had a division into so I'm not seeing it immediately, and I don't want to waste time, but there's the basic division into different types of the form, into the kind of different types of these concentrations, as the ones that were afflicted. The afflicted concentration, which wasn't like the real one, but it was so there's the afflicted one, then there was the pure one, then there was now we're talking about the causal equilibrium states, and then the fourth was the uncontaminated equilibrium. So there are those different types.
아니 디딩도니 다 민족 직대베지 고비 민족성지되고 그랬사니네와 민족 굴라때네 했습니다. 나분나 같은 책들이 돼요. 민족 구스비 다 디딩 고비 민족 세지와 다 고발을 해가지고 죽생지 민족 생이바 말때는 고발을 다 고비 민족 세지와 다 고비 민족이 아니 가리래 파부에 둘라 아니 집생 참여딩도 샌덴디 시즈무시가 된 맞지 파부기 12딩도 오늘 소화를 받아 두시라고 까비 아니 디디 가리래 디미도 제지라 고비 민족스네 오다 민족 구스나 디네베 잡고래 스타콜라 미바주고 죽생디 네베 잡니 아니 민족 구스 그래서 아니 민족 국이 있으면 계시는 다스 민족 심어도 민도 다 고바디 가와이 나서는 디라 고비 민족 무슨 고발을 미바주고 죽생디 오다 디 고바시 그래서 다 디인상다 진짜데 삼대기 민주당 수면 민족스입니다. 뒤에 남샤디베 제주고 이마디다 제르미지기 된다데 세링 나라다 돈도 디교도 왔다 주동들이 오나 걔나 삼대다 수면디다 람팀 탐제기 땡이베 운동을 지바티베 땡저라 가르치신 왔다 운동을 람 기비 지발라 삼대다 수면 민족스베 셰고에 제주고를 했어. 아니 뒤에 파지를 자 지다와시고 신 미니바 통에 다기 새로운 점식 셰도 제르미지기 아니 디마라바 나와 딘데기 세무시라면도 생산이 나라 아니 삼대시다 수매시 민주주의도 두스네 아니지 송고에 뒤다 주생 계정지 통문에 송마이 있다 대주동자도 인지선에다 드림 로젠디 다 딘데지 통에다 주동슈기 인지선에다 스타 주마 직다 모두 제대로 람림 거랑 sabject을 주의스 다 드림 로젠 딘데지 샤네다 투수에 김에다 소소에다 치와치레이나 당무도 고치기 있으지라
So we actually counted now going through the 4 meditative stabilization concentrations, the first through the fourth, as well as the 4 formless states. There's 1 through, again, 4 there. Then it gives us only 8, right? That gives us 8 equilibrium states. However, there are nine that are described. So what's the ninth one? The ninth one is called equilibrium of cessation. An equilibrium of cessation it's not a true equilibrium state. It's one that exists only for an Arya being. Again, so here this is an Arya being where there is a cessation of the coarse perception and as well as coarse feeling and coarse perception, and they're sort of engaging into this equilibrium of this cessation. 가리고 고불 가리고 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 고불 중심이랑 되면 두제 힘
디미두지레스 시바마레스 디미두지 다 고기 님주코랑 님주라는 고바 디샤 콜라티 녀바샤게 신세기스 무슨 참무지라더니 고바를 입어주고 죽습니다. 님주코는 라면다 고기 님주 디샤버레스.
So this is a type of what's called an abstract composite or a non-associated non-associated formation, because it's not actually a consciousness. It's something where there's an Arya being who is absorbed in the state of the peak of existence, and on the basis of that absorption state, on that equilibrium state, I'm using those terms interchangeably, by the way, absorption and equilibrium, so pardon me for switching back and forth. Then and the basis of absorption into the fourth state of the peak of existence, then they have the mind which engages in the equilibrium of cessation, which is a cessation of the coarse perception and feeling, and it is not a consciousness. So that's why it's not an actual an actual equilibrium state. Instead, it is an abstract composite. So we're going to read through the final verse that's on our text here, which Rinpoche gives to conclude this section. These concentrations and formless states are the basis for every path, so they are a very important topic for a treatise like the Ornament of Clear Realizations, also called Abhisamayalankara, that is demonstrating the sequence of the clear realizations. I have sketched them out here in view of the fact that most commentarial writers have not been able to explain them properly. So here we've gone over this side discussion of the concentrations. And we're going to, from here on out, return back to the heart of our class, which is the text on the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on stages of the path to enlightenment. And so this concludes this discussion about the different equilibrium states and concentrations. So if there are any questions, please, we can have a question and answer now.
I have a question about, it's my understanding that bodhisattvas would prefer to not go into the form and formless realms. They can't really help people there. So are they missing out on not going to these realms? Do they still do they still realize any of these without having to be reborn in the form and formless realm?
The Jiangsu Chenmo that's on me go normally go at the Chungzong the Jiangsu Chenmo yana ani the Zukang the Zume Kang la ke lengi maris kind of the something that's all that pepper to ki maris chezang the Jiangsu Chenmo that's all that Zukang the Zume Kang la ke lengi maris ani kewa malemba la that do nyamlen je to ki res kewa musu malemba la nyam je ki res.
다든다디 뉴죽세디 디비 카사지기 수기 뉴주 다 수기 뉴주 니가라 아니 우도 체니 남 그냥 공배주어디 요르와스 이네 디케발레디라 아니 디비 감나 케발레 바이 니 시든 두번에 시든 같이 와요 봐 수감나 기비 좀 있으면 요르스 이네 수메라 다 정신 다 레다니 뭐 미케바 좀 있으면 요르데 섬신도 기보면스 와 아니 정주위원데 바로 진행 교시 수매성 감수 개발도 님이 자스는 글라만 나한테 있어요. 근데서니 삼신도 개발된 말이스. 내가 뭐게 개발된 말이스. 디시저디랑 디요레스. 이내다 되바드랑 수공 감고 마시는 되비되라더니 신도의 생직이 된치와디 아니 자치와 치두에서 아니 되비되라 저기서 되비되라 야네 개발된 아니 신도 주바디 답시 디레스.
Yes, that's right. So the bodhisattvas are able to engage in a more vast benefit of living beings in the desire realm. And as was mentioned, a person in the desire realm is able to actualize all 8 of these different concentrations while being a desire realm being. So these are meditation states that they attain and practice while being in the desire realm. So that's the first through the fourth meditative stabilizations, as well as the 4 formless concentrations. There are bodhisattvas who take rebirth in the form realm. There are not bodhisattvas who intentionally take rebirth in the formless realms, although there are occasions when a bodhisattva, by power of their karma, that without having the wish to do so, will take birth in a formless realm state. That can happen, but generally, as you said, it's more there's more potential to be of greater benefit and accomplish the needs of beings in the desire realm. So that's generally where bodhisattvas intentionally take birth, when they have that power to intentionally take birth. And this type of advice is given in the text called the Uttara Tantra by Maitreya. Geshe gave the actual quotation, which I don't know it, but it is basically saying just that, for bodhisattvas to not take birth in the formless realms.
Thank you.
Ishla. Lo di tanda nga zu chidangi 다음에 weeki 동니 세치로와 디다 단다 지야 메베들 군이 바르 대화를 게 유나메나.
동니당 지양 메스 셰베니 발 개발이래 개발가래 인지도라이라 보다. So the question is, when we're talking about these formless realm concentrations and this state of nothing whatsoever, there's nothing whatsoever, and then we have, the selflessness and emptiness. So like, what's the difference between emptiness and nothing whatsoever?
지가스나지 퇴원담이가 하니 최담지 요마레스 탄여도 요레 스니와 디섬노다에디 아니 퇴원담만 막고라는 뭐고라 퇴원담만 맞주와 누가 똥니기 되다디 가져가야디 그러면 되지 퇴원담만 대마루가 많이 봐 어디든지 뭐어디 바꿔고 그러와 디 뭐가베 가져 메가지고 근데 지야메 세디 아니 순자 라빠 너와다지 가스나 수기 뒤셔당 아니 디 가리데 뭐게 남식이 두시 니가 아니 다 소다 소매 가르기 아니 지 미과 가르치는 지엔도 선거 딘데지 공공공공원이 딘데지 내가 들었더니 오네와 다른 것이 도인데 다 지엔이 상고지 오네와 내면서 기가에 가자리당 진다 돈이기 되니 가야메서 어디니 가자게 걸 말해서 딘데지.
When we talk about emptiness, what the topic is regarding is that ultimately all phenomena are empty. They're ultimately not there, non-existent, while conventionally they exist. So this is getting at something which is the entity or the nature of the objects, nature of phenomena themselves. So it's saying that they are not established by nature naturally. They're not established with an essence. Phenomena are not established with an essence. So what is this ultimate? What is this? It is now the non-affirming negation, and I hope some of you will be familiar with this terminology. Some may not be. It is a non-affirming negation. That is the negation of essence, negation of nature, and it is a mere negation of that object of negation. So the object of negation for emptiness and the object of negation for this formless concentration of nothing whatsoever are very different. So in the formless realm concentration of nothing whatsoever, there is no perception of form. There is no perception of formlessness. There's just this perception, nothing whatsoever. So those coarser perceptions are negated. They're negated, but that's very different from the object of negation of emptiness, which is a nature of things or an essence of things.
두체나.
If no one else has another question, you made it sound like, or not made it sound, that once they actually just start thinking about the faults of the state before, that they'll actually attain the next state. That sounds really quite simple. Do they actually does it just come to them after they think about the fault, or do they have to sit for many years before they go to the next state? Sorry if it's a silly question.
I missed, I think, the first. So you said, did they have to take many years? Or what was the first part of
Well, it was more just, it makes it sound like all they have to do is think of the faults of the state before, and then they then attain the next state. Is it that simple?
The something dambo ni ni ba na so ba ta suma shu. So dambo ta rangi sa gi kyen dang ni ani sa goma gi jig near do ne do to de ani sa goma gi kyen thong go da ta kyen thong wa tsam gi ani de le sa tho thok do gi re bes na di ta de bo shira ta de bo ta bo dos de de tsam 제나 양 this cancer was 제상 the low mombo 장고를 베 단단 랑기 사디 듀림보 담보 장고를 베 제만 깬 통화 썸기 아니 야 좀기를 베
어디 어디 가서는 랑기 사디라단 아무데나 교인 너무 통과하고 딱 그런 게 누구서 이순이 배는 대발 수검나야 수미 선대 뭐지는 대발하다지 대발도 교인 뭐하다 연대 제거 왔다 아니 가슴지 예방 망와 뒤에 교인 통통통인데 다들 지서 말해서 이순이 기획이 다 순환되라더니 배서 못 당당당 남신은 다 대발라 그런 다 사들아 미비 아니 차바디 아니 지금 카요디 아니 공부가 필요했다 이 차바디 가야에서 못 당당 그래서 교인 통화 점기 공부가 필요해 말했어 교인 통이 다 교인이 결혼식 심바디 고액이 아니 예도도 공 아니 예도도 공공공공공이 아니 교인 통행이 어떻게 제수 당했다 예도 공이 예도기더니 살 호마호마가 미비 세방 우주와디 아니处理 무슨니까 아니 다 되도록 교인 통화 점기야 공부가 필요해 말했어 뒤에 가서 그다음에 드시는 교인 와서 무슨 교인 통이 다 가르치기래 다 교인 뒤가 미비 세바디니 다 도에게 답시지 버렸어 다 세바디 도에가 다 뭐라도 세바디 공비치고여서 세바 책임 친구다 안 차라 수능으로 왔다 라바 돈에요 참모도마도 대외적 책 참모습니다 아니 배들은 진짜기 제발집니다 되도 말더니 무슨 바시더니 막 방에 답시지 예도 고민되니 신이더니 야 고민 무엇이 더고 얼마도 지기 교회 도와점이 되고 말했어
So it's not quite so simple as just seeing the disadvantages of the current state you're in. That's what initiates the process of going into the higher state, of moving on to the next concentration. So first you see the faults of the faults of the state that you're in, and seeing that the state you're in has more faults than good qualities, more faults than beneficial aspects. And so you desire to be free from attachment to it. But the problem is there's extraordinarily strong habitual energy of that craving and attachment for the lower state, whichever lower state it is. So let's use the example of the desire realm. So there's great attachment and craving for desire realm things. So you can't just abandon it by seeing it has faults right away. So first you see it has faults, the desire realm, and then you generate this access concentration of the first meditative stabilization, the first concentration, right? So the access concentration of the first concentration, it has all these different stages in it, these different stages of the small, medium, and great, because you have to abandon the different degrees of subtlety of attachment to the desire, this craving. So you have to abandon the coarser levels and then the subtler levels. And so you meditate over and over through a long period of time and think again and again about the faults of desire, the faults of desire, thinking about it again and again. And then eventually you're able to eliminate the more subtle degrees of grasping and craving to the desire realm and attain the actual concentration of the first concentration. But it is a long process with many stages and and a lot of takes a lot of practice.
Thank you for clarifying.
Geshe 다 tuwa tian shinda mena nge tuwa chi ti chuwa chi. Di tanda nga zu tanda di na la nu fe chi le du di inji na yabu shita gyurmu du che nga zu nu da chu fe di kunzu da kuwa nye la chik nu da chu fe di chik ma tishe chi gyuru na shuwi.
So this is, well, the question itself is about the terminology and the translation here, but I'll just find the term that's being used, but the questioner is referring to two terms in Tibetan, which are ne and chu. And could you just say what they were in English? Because I'm not seeing it right now.
Oh, in the text, it says container. Actually, it doesn't mean container. If you say container, it's like you're putting water in the container. Mm-hmm. The actual meaning is different. So
one of the terms was container, and the other one, I think it said the juice or something. Right?
Chu. Yeah. It is not in here.
So it's on page. Okay, again, the pages are numbered. Yes. Anyway, the page. I'll just read the sentence where they came in today's class. So it said, hence both the form realm container world and the ripened result, that is the juice, i.e. the person living in the container world. So here the questioner is referring to this term container world, and then the juice, i.e. the person living in the container world. So he's saying those are kind of strange translations, so people might not understand them. Can you please explain them better? I agree, those are strange translations, but I don't know a better one, so you know. So the container here is referring to the abode, the place where beings live. It's the place where beings take birth, and that's what the container here is. And then the juice, the person. Well, it's exactly that. The part in parentheses, the person living in the container world. So the container is the container, sometimes called the container world, is where beings take birth, and then the juice, the Tibetan term again, ju, is where beings, are the beings who are taking birth in the world.
Tuchina, thank you.
So then we can leave it here for tonight. Thank you, everybody.
어쨌나 계실라.
Thank you.
Thank you.
네, 주지제.
Thank you.
Good night.